But welcome everyone. Welcome back to our Launch and Learn on digital product release. This is our final session. We're going to be covering advanced automation and policy administration. My name is Greg Hollis, and we have Colin O'Brien back today to present. Okay, so safe harbor. You've all seen this slide. So this presentation may contain some forward-looking statements. They're based on our beliefs at the moment. So please just don't take anything you hear or see as set in stone, as it could change.
Okay, everybody. So again, our vision for DPR, we've done a lot through the maturity journey where we've, gotten started and we've been kind of creeping up the maturity curve to having more and more automation in place, because our goal is for us to automate as much of the process as we can, especially around, are we ready to release? Like, that is our goal. I would like for teams that are using this to only need to come into DPR when there's something that they need to accomplish, like there's a policy that's not compliant, or there's a specific task, but those tasks should be minimized to where, especially approval tasks, to be minimized so that we are really leveraging data in order to understand if we are ready to release. So if we go back to the adoption, we started with just creating releases and having manual tasks in place. We then went into how we can leverage integrations to both help with planning, as well as how we can use the larger CI/CD tool integrations to even create the change requests themselves and automate the authorization process by looking at the data within DPR, so within a release. So this final is getting into, we have policies that ServiceNow ships with, but we need to leverage our own policies, not just minorly editing, but starting from scratch. So for today, I'm going to go through creating a custom policy so you can see how we do this. So because we're in this webinar, if there are questions, put it into the Q&A and we'll try and answer them as we go. We should have plenty of time for today. I've run through this a couple of times, so fingers crossed I don't have any issues as we go through it for today. So one other just bit of information, we have our content pack that we ship with a variety of common policies that we were getting from our customers. I'd love to hear more about, their additional things that would be helpful. And the reason for that is we're not going to be able to get every policy into our content pack. But if I see, 60, 70, 80% of customers are like, this is something we use or that we need, that's how we determine what goes into our content pack, is to help jumpstart you and help with the common set of policies so that you don't have to manage them. Now for today, I'm going to be going over, again, a custom policy. I've got a little bit of setup I've got to review because this came from a request in our last session. I will be doing a policy that looks at the test management. Specifically, I chose test management V2 to look at data from test management V2 in order to define one of our policies. And the reason we've got a review set up is because there is not currently an integration, like an explicit integration between test management V2 and DPR. So I added a field so that I could link the two, and then I use that information in order to create the policies. So once we review what I did, because again, it's very minor setup, but I want to kind of set expectations, then we're going to go into defining a data collector. Now, I said last time, this will be on the more technical side. Data collectors are done in JavaScript. So I've already written the JavaScript. I'm not going to write it from scratch. Not even planning to go through it in deep detail, just some of the high-level concepts, because data collectors are a great way for you to separate out where the data comes from the policies, which is more how the data is used. And then I'll actually execute it. I'll show you what goes on in order to get this data. So data collectors, again, we've talked a lot about policies. Policies look at data within ServiceNow in order to determine whether you're compliant or non-compliant. But sometimes that data is either not in a form that can be consumed, or it's really complicated as to how to get to it. So data collectors were designed so that you can separate out the data, especially when you're trying to aggregate data, from how that data is used. Because policies with the condition builder approach doesn't require code. It requires that you understand where information is coming from, but you don't have to use code in order to define a policy. But if the data is spread out or if it's difficult, then data collectors are a great way to have a ServiceNow developer pull information together, and then you can use it within your policies and you can reuse it across multiple policies. So it's new. So with the August release that came out last Thursday, data collectors were opened up for anybody with the right roles to create prior to August. So if you have it in subprod and you're looking at our May release or even our initial February release, and you try to create a data collector, you can't create one. You can create them starting in August. So I'm on the August release now, and you can have a ServiceNow developer create these data collectors, which you can then use when you're defining policies. So before I switch over to my instance, Greg, are there any questions or chats that I should be aware of and answer before I switch over?
Let's see. Yeah, we have one in the chat. Is there a GUI for the data collector? Do you need to know JavaScript?
Yeah, so there is a GUI, but the GUI is mostly for the GUI is mostly for like I have a place to put the code in. So it's you'll be seeing it. So you'll see it in just a little bit. Okay, so let's go into DPR. So, and actually, you know what? Let's also just have test management in the background. At least I thought I told you to go into the background, but it looks like I didn't. Never mind. Let me switch back. Okay, so what I did, one thing that I did before we got things going, because test management v2 does not integrate right now with release with DPR. It's probably something that we'll need to build an integration for. It's come up enough times that it's a backlog item. But what I did is I have this Parts Unlimited 1.0, and I added a relationship on the release record to say, what is the test plan that validates this release? So for those of you all that are not familiar, I'll bring up the test board so we can go through it. Test Management 2.0, and I chose 2.0 because I understand it. I was the PM for its initial design, and so I remember the relationships on it. Test Management 2.0 was designed to be used to say, hey, what are the tests that we have? So we have test plans. So this is my August release test plan. It has some test cycles, which are like phases for your testing. And then there are test suites. Test suites I'll drill into them. So my test cycles then have test suites. Test suites are collections of tests that you assign to someone who runs them. Now, these have all passed. I'm still going to run it a little bit later, but this is basically what we'd be validating. However, in order to get to it, you'll notice that I had to go from, I have a test plan. Now I've got to go through all of the test cycles in order to get to the test suites that then have my tests. So that was a bunch of hops in order to get to the data that I ultimately need. And even once I get here, these results are actually result records. So it's not just a value, it's pointing to yet another record. And while you'll see that I do have some aggregate data here, so I could short circuit. If all I care about is the percent passing, which actually my policy is just looking at percent passing, then I actually don't need a data collector because I can just look at this particular value. But if I wanted additional information, like for instance, if I wanted to also have a policy that said there should be at least one test per feature, like that could be a policy. We want to have a test per feature. Then I need actual numbers, not just aggregate, like not just percentages, in order to get to that number. So I didn't actually build that policy, but that is a way where we can use all of this data in multiple ways, not just for what's the percent passing, but I can have some additional checks to just say, hey, if we don't have at least as many tests as we have features, then something's off. We're not testing everything. And that could be a policy on using this data collector in a variety of ways. So let me get back into DPR. And so the only additional thing I did was I put a reference from the release to the test plan. I decided not to do it at the individual phases. Could have done that as well, but I just figured a release has a test plan, so that is the integration I did. All right, so with the setup done, adding that one relationship, let's get into the actual policies themselves. So I've moved into policy administration, and I'm going to start off in data collectors. Now I have already created a data collector down here, but I'm going to start from scratch so that you see what was involved. Again, scratch does not mean though that I'm going to code this from the start. I have it in on a text editor and another screen. So let's create a new one. So this is going to be TM2 test results. That's the name of it. Category is optional, but I'll say this is being used for digital product release. And you'd maybe want to give it a description, results from my test plans. And I have now a new data collector. Data collectors, just like policies, are versioned. So by default, I am in a draft of the first version that I would need to go in and now define. So I'm going to go into this draft and start defining things. Now, the build side, this is where, to answer the question, is there UI? There is. The UI is mostly me coding on this side, and then me defining the inputs and the outputs for this particular data collector. So for the data collector, if you look through our data collectors, most of them have a single input. That input is going to be the release phase that we're looking at, because again, each the label is release. Because the policies are at a phase level, so you need to define it for the phase, and what we are going to pass in is the sysid of that release phase. That's how we'll use it. There's no default value here, and this should just be sysid of the release phase. It's probably kind of self-evident, but we've got a description, and it is mandatory. We cannot use this data collector if we don't provide this value. So we have our input. Now we need to define our outputs. So outputs would be things like passing tests. So this would be the count of passing tests. It defaults to 0, and it should be a number. It should be an integer. And we also want to know about our maybe failing tests. And again, an integer. And it will default to 0. I'm not going to create as many as I actually put in my policy, but there should also be percent passing. And again, I use integers here. You could use floats, but I use an integer. So it's going to be a whole number. So it won't be like 57.3. It'll just say 57%. And then we'll also do percent failing. And then maybe the last one that we want are the total test cases. Because again, this can be used in a variety of ways. Don't think of these data collectors as in it's used for a particular policy. Think about if I'm trying to get results of my test cases, what results do I want? Like what's all the values that we want to have? So there's also blocking and not run. There's a variety of more values I could have here. And you should have them all in the data collector so the data collector can be reused in multiple places. So now that I've got my inputs and outputs, now it's time to start coding. But again, I am not going to code this from scratch. I'm going to paste in, and I'm going to go over a couple of segments of it. So I'll do it from here because this is a little bit bigger screen. So the first thing is that this particular JavaScript, it starts off with just the body missing, but it takes inputs and it takes outputs. The inputs, they came from here. So whatever the variable name is, that is going to be a property of the input object that comes in. So we have our input of release phase. You'll see I even have it here, inputs.release phase. I use that in order to get to the actual phase record. And then we have outputs. Now, I zeroed all of the outputs. It's just a thing I do. It's not, I don't think I've seen any of our developers do it, so it's not necessarily required. But I just liked making sure that all of my outputs were defined ahead of time. Because if I come across any issues, like if I don't have any test cycles, I exit immediately, and I've got values in place by exiting immediately. So again, I define mine up here, but inputs are used. I only had one input. It's used to get the release phase. Then you'll notice in this code that I have a lot of, okay, I get the test cycles. And then once I've got the test cycles, I get the execution suites. Once I've got the execution suites, I have to get the test assignments. Once I have the test assignments, I get the results, and I loop through all the results. This code here, you'll notice, is what I'm trying to abstract away. Because if you're creating policies, maybe you're a JavaScript person, but I don't expect you to be a JavaScript person. I expect you to just want to use the results of it. I then do a bunch of math, and ultimately I pass back into my outputs all of the values that this calculated. So I did some math because I've got my passing divided by total times 100 to get it into the range. Same thing here, and I make sure it's an integer. That then becomes my outputs. So again, I'm not focused on the JavaScript here. Just know that the JavaScript is meant to use glide records. You could technically make REST calls, whatever you need in order to get to values that you then pass back. That is the point of data collectors. And then once you have those data collectors, did I name everything the same? Passing tests, failing tests. I just don't have blocked. And I don't have not run. So I need to just remove them. So no blocked and no not run. But everything else I think is the same. I'll probably use the other one I did for the end. And then I activate this data collector. Data collectors, again, are the more complex side. There is no condition builder for data collectors. You are expected to be a JavaScript person. You're expected to be a ServiceNow developer in order to interact with and build data collectors. So if you are thinking, through our implementation plan, where do I need a ServiceNow development team? Especially if you're building new policies, this is where you will need them the most. So think about what information you need, and then they'll figure out how do they get that information so that you can use it in your policies. So before I move over into using this in a policy, Greg, are there any chats or Q&As that I should be aware of, and then I'll move into using this in a policy.
Nope, nothing at the moment.
Okay, perfect. So I now have a data collector. Now I want to use that in our policies. So I'm going to go to policies, and I'm going to create a new policy. So depending on a variety of things, because Pace has different templates in place, you might see a screen that has more options here. I just start with a blank policy, and we're going to give it a name. This is going to be TM2 90. Actually, I'm going to do 50% tests passing. The reason I'm going to do 50 is because I think that is how many are passing in my demo when I was setting it up earlier. 50 is kind of low. I'm sure yours are 100, but I'm going to go ahead and create this new policy. And you'll notice that it's a similar, initial experience. But where it now starts to differ is in the policy builder. So the policy builder is going to allow me to define what my conditions are. You can switch to having a high code version. So if I do switch to code editor, then you actually don't really have to have data collectors at that point, because everything I just did when I use the data collector could be done in a high code version of your policy. So you might have situations where your policy just requires code. You can't do it with condition builders. Then there is a high code, like there's this is the no code side. There is a requires code side. But I'm going to stick with having the low code condition builder. We do have some things that are, again, it's a little more on the technical side, but doesn't require programming, just requires concepts to be understood. API variables, don't really worry about that for today. This is going to be information that we pass in to every single policy that runs. So I have pipelines and epic information and information about the artifact versions. We go to configuration parameters. This is where you could, when I said 50% of tests passing, I could have that here. Like I could say that I need to have some value, and I manually type in 50%. But our recommendation is that you have what are called config parameters. This could be the test passing threshold, and it's going to be an integer because I've been dealing with integers, and its default value is 50. And now I'm specifying that I've got a place to manage the fact that our threshold is 50, especially if we need to reference that 50 in multiple places here. It's better to have it stored as configuration parameter that you'll use. And if you need to duplicate this template, maybe you've got a 50% template for internal, but an 80% template or an 80% policy for your more external, then only having to change the configuration parameter makes it a whole lot easier to manage these policies. And then we have, the record reference, don't worry about that. That's if I need to do a query for information, a simple query to get it a table or a record. And then finally, we have data collectors. And I need to add the fact that I'm going to use a data collector. And I have my TM2 test results. And we'll just call this TM2 test results. You can see a little bit of information. So if you are building the policy, you'll see that there are inputs. Now this input will be figured out at runtime, but you'll go in here and say, I'm going to reference the document, which is the release phase, and I need to get the sysid. That is going to be my input when using this data collector. And the outputs, well, these are all the outputs. So I'll know I can view them. I don't do anything here. I just view the fact that these are outputs. But inputs, you do have to say, this is where the data is coming from. With DPR, again, the document is the release phase. It's always the release phase. We pass in the release phase in order to validate our policies. And so I've got this here, and I'm hitting save, and I can now use this data collector. So now the most technical side of the policy setup is done. At this point, we set our conditions. So for instance, I could have a condition that says if there are no test results, then we're going to fail things. So for here, or let's say no test cases. So technically, if there are no test cases, I might have 100% of them passing. But if there are no test cases, I'm going to look at the data collectors. I'm going to look at the test management to test results. And I'm going to look at the total test cases. And if it is 0, why am I not able to hit? Is, let's see, less than or is 0. Okay, for some reason, my instance is giving me an issue. I can't type in that field for some reason, because again, I'm doing a demo. So of course I will have an issue. Well, that's why I have a backup. So instead of creating this one, I will use the one that I had already built yesterday when I was setting everything up. So you'll see that I had no tests found. I was a little more terse in what I typed in here. But if I had no results found, which the way I validate that is if my test plan total tests is 0, then I specify that this is a non-compliant policy. And I log a message. You have to have tests on your test plan. And I've got a failure message, which would be in DPR. Like I can actually see this failure message that tells me that we had 0 total test cases. But if I do have, like if it's not 0, then the next thing we look at is the percent of tests passing greater than or equal to our passing threshold. So again, I have a configuration parameter called passing threshold in this one. And so long as the value is above it, then we say that this is a compliant policy. I don't really log anything, but I do give a result that says what the actual percentages are. Then the last one is else. Basically, if I don't have, if it's less than my passing threshold, I specify it's non-compliant. I give a little bit of logging that tells me some information, and I put a failure output that says what the percentage of test cases passing are. So these are my conditions that I set up. 2 of them are non-compliant. 1 is compliant. Again, there could be more based on nuance, but this then allows me to have my policy defined. And I didn't have to code. I just had to have a developer, a ServiceNow developer, get the data for me, which I could again use in a variety of policies. That is the goal of these data sources. That didn't take me as long to fill out since I had to fall back to see why my instance won't let me type into it sometimes. And the last thing, which you didn't get to see because I'm already here, you do have to publish. There's a publish option. Every time you make a change, like if I needed to change what the output message is, then that will make a new version. So I have an archived version. I can see what the archived version looks like. I'm currently on version 2.0. Only one version can be active at any given time. You can have a draft. So if I were to create a copy, then I'd be in draft 2.1. This draft is not used until I publish it. So if I wanted to say no, let's say for some reason, okay, that, well, I'm not going to be saving this one. But if I were to have updated this, then I need to publish a new version because I've made a change. So the draft version is just draft. It is not active. It will not be used until I publish it. But I'm not going to because I forgot that I can't enter numbers in here for some reason. So that's creating a policy. Again, the core thing is to know what data you want and how it's going to be used. And at that point, you will be able to create a policy. But now, how would it be used? So let's go into my actual release. So I'm in this Parts Unlimited 1.0 release, and I have some policies. Now, I added to the planning phase because I was in the planning phase. I added my policy here, which tells me that Test Management 2.0 right now is non-compliant because I have a threshold of 80%, and currently it is at 57%. Because remember, I have a failure message that comes out. So we are passing, this is something started with August. I am passing the info that came from the executions so people can see, okay, if it is a non-compliant, why is it? In that case, I had no results, but I did have a failure message that I outputted. So if I go in now into Test Management 2.0, I need to impersonate Joe, who has the all right, something has happened in my instance because Joe Offenberg was my person who ran my tests. Let me reassign them real quickly. So if I go into my tests and change this to, I'll make Eileen the person who has to do it. For all. Okay, so if I now impersonate Eileen, then I can go into with Test Management 2.0. I can go to the tests assigned to me. We have several tests assigned, so I'm going to select them and run them. I'll give it a second test. And now I'm going to go through. In this case, I'm going to fail them. I'm just going to say this one's failed. This one's failed. We'll say this one passed, and this one passed. All right, so I have results. Some passed, some failed. So now that I've run these, if I go back into DPR and I run the policies again, it's going to look at that data. We're going to run the policies again. Policy has been scheduled. And now we wait for just a moment for the results to come in, and the message should update unless something else broke while I slept last night. Oh, no, there we go. So now we're down even further. We're still non-compliant, but you'll see that the failure message updated. Only 28% of our test cases are passing because several of them haven't been run yet. So my example policy looks at passing versus total. Some tests haven't been run. So we're at a low percentage passing rate right now, which means we're non-compliant, which can be fine when we're early in the phase. But for the end of our phase, we should be compliant, and that would cause our risk score to go up because we're actually very far behind. So this one's already red on risk, but I can't move forward because our Test Management 2.0 tests are not passing. So since I couldn't do all of it from scratch, I am ahead of time by about a little more than 5 minutes. I wanted to leave 15 minutes at the end because since this is a more technical one, I expect there to be a few more questions. So if there are, now's a good time to ask, to put things in chat or to put things in Q&A, and I can answer on how any questions about the policies, data collectors of the policies themselves, and how they're used. Now is a good time.
We just had one. Where is the actual test data in PDF, Excel, etc.?
So in this case, the test data, because it's in Test Management 2.0, is in those tables. You could have, let's say you're doing testing with Excel. For that, I'd have to do some research into whether or not we can actually get into the Excel data itself. You'd most likely want to capture it in actual records. But I have had customers that want to attach to either the release or to the phase or even to a task um, the results of those tests. So if you were doing testing in in Excel, what I know you can do, you could do a policy that looked at attachments, looked for the existence of attachments on whichever record you use. But I don't think we can actually get into the data um, because it's Excel, and I just don't recall. I'd have to look to see if we have libraries that read Excel data from JavaScript. Now, if you're using, again, I use Test Management 2.0, so there are Test Management 2.0 records. If you're using integrations through our like CI/CD integrations to pull test results, that's being stored in the DevOps data model. That's stored in our test results within DevOps. But in the case of if it's in Excel, you can check for attachments, but I don't think we can read the contents of them to know whether or not you're at whatever threshold. You could just say there are results that have been attached. Okay. So then what about links to the data? So if so links, it kind of depends. If you're storing, let's say you're storing the data in what's called sorry, if you're storing the results like in a SharePoint site, then again we can look at that there's a link, but you'd have to do like a REST call in order to get information, and so that we can only really see that there are links. Now, if you're needing it for integration with like our integrated risk management, so if you're doing policies and looking at data within IRM, then IRM can actually look at the actual source of the data within ServiceNow to validate your policies. And we do track, let me see real quick. If I were to go into the mapping of these policies, we do track, execution information. So if people are needing to, dig in more as to what's going on, what version was being used, then more tracking is used, including, what values were being looked at and what, your config things are. So there is more data being stored. But again, that's if the data is in ServiceNow. Okay, so then there was another question. Can you have multiple test plans per phase? So in this case, I connected DPR to Test Management 2.0, and I did it in a way that just said, here's my test plan for the release. Because I did it custom, I certainly could have done something where I, instead of linking it from the release to say, here's my test plan, I could have said, here, this test plan goes to this phase or goes to this release, in which case, yes, you could. But that's a custom integration. Custom really set up more of how the two talk to each other. It's fairly easy configuration to do within ServiceNow, but you do have to create a relationship between the two. So if you're doing it yourself, then the answer is yes, you could set things up so that each phase had multiple test plans. And you just you'd have to do that as a part of your implementation. Again, we will probably be getting into an out-of-box integration with Test Management 2.0. It's a win, and I do need to spend time on what should that look like within DPR versus what should that look like within Test Management 2.0. How do we bring them together? That's come up enough times now where we're definitely investigating how it should work out of box. Okay. Those are all the chats that I've seen. If there aren't additional questions, I can show. At least I should be able to. I need to now. I have to check whether or not my instance is going to behave. But I can show a little bit of connections into IRM that right now take a little bit of configuration, but is something that will be out of box in a future release. So we're going outside of what's in August and what is coming in the future. So if there are no more questions on policies, I can talk a bit about how these policies can be connected with integrated risk management. That's a part of GRC. So you have to be licensed for for integrated risk management. I don't know all the GRC SKUs, so I don't know which ones give you access to what. But if there are no other questions, that's one other thing I can go into before we wrap for the day. Okay, I don't see any others, so let me go into let me see if I actually even have this instance configured or if I need to jump into another one. Yes, this one is configured for exceptions. Okay. Again, this is something that it can be done in August, but requires some configuration to set up. We're going to include that configuration. We're currently sizing whether we can get it into November or if it will be in February. Most likely it'll be November. But this is a capability that actually comes with the policy as code editor, which is referred to as control point exception. It basically allows you to have controls mapped to these policies and PACE and have an exception process for, let's say that that you can't meet this particular requirement and you need an exception, an actual exception in place. Well, in order to do that, let me go into the compliance workspace, talk through a little bit about the fundamentals behind it. So let's go into my control objectives. And this one, I'm trying to find one that I've already set up so that it doesn't take time. So if you are not familiar with IRM, integrated risk management has authoritative documents that have control objectives that then have controls in order to manage whether or not you are compliant with this control objective. So this is test all software changes before you implement them in prod. You can add policies that come from within DPR in order to validate that we actually meet these objectives. So I've mapped 2 policies here, which are going to be enforcing this particular control objective. But was there I see a chat. Okay. So, and actually this is not a good one. This was one I did during testing. See if I can find we created some test ones. I should be able to do this live. I just need one that doesn't have any policies to show what happens. So I can add policies to this control objective. It will then look at which policies are identified for saying, yes, this does meet whatever our requirements are. And once I add them in the background, it is going to create a bunch of controls that validate across all of our releases. Now, this can take some time, so I may not have enough time to go into it in more depth. But basically what happens is, for all of those policies, it's going to look at your releases, and those will be listed as controls that you're validating. Your compliance team will care a lot about that because, again, it validates the data and validates that the policies are compliant and helps with audit. Now I'm not gonna wait for the background task to finish. Once that is set up, that unlocks the ability from within digital product release to ask for exceptions to a particular control. So my 80% test passing, I have a release that that isn't able to meet it. So for this particular release phase, I have this policy that I've asked for an exception that will go through an exception process. So if I were to, and this one's already been validated, but when you're using IRM, this will actually even put in place, there are specific time period that you are even able to keep this compliance in place. And what that does, this one's already granted, what that does is that when you have, and I'm just going to go into a release, you'll notice that I have these two, compliant and non-compliant. If you have an exception in place and the exception is within the time period, because again, exceptions are only good for a certain amount of time, maybe a month, maybe 6 months, that's your compliance team. Then there is another value that will show up here that says compliant with an exception or compliant with exceptions. That means that this particular policy ran, it technically failed. So we still have the data about what happened, but we will still be able to continue through this release, or at least through this phase, because we have that exception in place. If the exception wasn't in place, we wouldn't be able to continue, but that will allow us to continue through the process on a policy by policy basis that is in compliance with your actual compliance team. So again, it's something that we can set up today. So if you are implementing DPR, if you're using integrated risk management and you want to take advantage of this, the feature's already done. It's just there are a couple of records that have to be created to let IRM know that you want this with DPR. Most likely in November, those configuration records will just be in place. But if you need help and you want to use this in the meantime, reach out to us and we can help you with doing that setup. It's we got a knowledge article on how to do it. It doesn't require us to even like hop into your instance. We can just provide what the actual steps are for you to tell IRM about DPR. All right, so with that, we've got about 6 minutes. Because of the last session, I just want to thank everyone. If there are any other questions, were there any other questions, Greg, in the Q&A before I switch back over?
Nope, nothing's coming through.
Okay, well then go back to the PowerPoint real quick. So again, I want to call out, well, first of all, again, thank you all for joining in these sessions. I've enjoyed, connecting, hearing feedback, and even getting examples for doing, this session. So thank you all for participating. Definitely leverage our community sites. So we're producing content. We've got some videos that are being produced right now. You'll recognize many of the voices because Greg's done some, I'm doing some, we've got Joe doing some, Balaji, who's on this call, is doing one. And so we're all kind of pitching into creating videos to help people get started. Those will be there. And we are also engaged answering questions. So definitely leverage the community. You have our contact information. And I have several names from our last session on the rollout plans. And we'll be kicking that off in the next couple of weeks. So you should be hearing more from us. But if there are no further questions, then again, I just want to thank you all for joining and participating through these past seven sessions. And if you have anything, you can always reach out.